In the debate, you were asked to clarify if you believe Trump lost the 2020 election. Do you believe he lost the 2020 election?
I think that Donald Trump and I have both raised a number of issues with the 2020 election, but we're focused on the future. I think there's an obsession here with focusing on 2020. I'm much more worried about what happened after 2020, which is a wide open border, groceries that are unaffordable. And look,
Senator, yes or no?
Okay.
Did Donald Trump lose the 2020 election?
Let me ask you a question. Is it okay that big technology companies censored the Hunter Biden laptop story, which independent analysis have said it cost Donald Trump millions of votes?
Senator Vance, I'm going to ask you again. Did Donald Trump lose the 2020 election?
Did big technology companies censor a story that independent studies have suggested would have cost Trump millions of votes?
Senator Vance, I'm going to ask you again. Did Donald Trump lose the 2020
election? And I've answered
election?
your question with another question. You answer my question and I'll answer yours.
I have asked this question repeatedly. It is something that is very important for the American people to know. There is no proof, legal or otherwise, that Donald Trump did not lose the 2020 election.
You're repeating a slogan rather than engaging with what I'm saying, which is that when our own technology firms engage in industrial scale censorship, by the way, backed up by the federal government in a way that independent studies suggest affect the votes, I'm worried about Americans who feel like there were problems in 2020. I'm not worried about this slogan that people throw. Well, every court case went this way. I'm talking about something very discrete. A problem of censorship in this country that I do think affected things in 2020, and more importantly, that led to Kamala Harris's governance, which has screwed this country up in a big way.
Senator, would you have certified the election in 2020? Yes or no?
I've said that I would have voted against certification because of the concern that I just raised. I think that when you have technology companies—
The answer is no.
When you have technology companies censoring Americans at a mass scale in a way that, again, independent studies have suggested affect the vote, I think that it's right to protest against that, to criticize that, and that's a totally reasonable thing.
So the answer is no. And the last question,
Well, that's J.D. Vance not answering the question about whether or not he would, Donald Trump lost the election, just like he always does. And what I thought, though, interesting beyond that, I know you've seen that, and that's from the interview with the New York Times. What I also thought was interesting about that is his behavior towards the interviewer. I mean, look at the way he virtually just bullies her. You're not answering my question. You're not answering my question. He has a very weird tone when it comes to women, when it comes to his faith, when it comes to a lot of things. So we've spent the last three shows, I think, talking about things we may have forgotten about Donald Trump's behavior in the first term, things that he's promised to do in his second term and using the military and but I want to talk now as we look towards the election, which is just 2.5, 3 weeks away. We want to talk about how there's one guy who's just a heartbeat away from the presidency we know very little about, but what we do know is really, really disconcerting. You know, he has only got 1.5 years of government service, and he's accomplished virtually nothing in the Senate. Like, nothing has been accomplished by J.D. Vance in the United States Senate. So how on earth did a guy with so little qualifications, who's so very strange, get the nod to be the vice president? Well, it's a very strange movement. He's part of a collision of a new militant form of evangelicalism, the bro tech culture, toxic masculinity, all associated with Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and the Trump bros. This is who we are. And the same interview, you can kind of hear that strain. And I want you've probably seen this, but that strangeness that makes people queasy about J.D. Vance. Keep in mind, his wife is Hindu. Let's watch this clip. Same interview.
Right. You didn't sign up for a weekly churchgoer. I feel terrible for my wife because we go to church almost every Sunday unless we're on the road. And
does she go with you? I mean,
she does. Yeah, she does.
Has she converted?
No, she hasn't. No, that's why I feel bad about it. Is she's got 3 kids. Obviously, I help with the kids, but because I'm kind of the one going to church, she feels like more responsibility to keep the kids quiet in the church. And I felt kind of bad, like, oh, you didn't sign up to marry a weekly churchgoer, and are you okay with this? And she was sort of more than okay with it, and that was a big part of, I guess, the confirmation that this was the right thing for me.
Yeah, his wife is Hindu, and he takes her to church to watch her kids. Something he does a lot. He talks about her kids. He also said in a previous interview that while she's not white, he loves her anyway. I mean, woo. Okay, so what is this all about? And where is this guy at? And that's why I talk about how close is the presidency? How dangerous is it? Well, you probably saw this. I want to run this montage of Donald Trump's DJ set in Oaks, Pennsylvania. Just let's watch this montage of this went on for 40 minutes.
Well, sir, do you want to play your song and then greet a few people, or do you want to? Well, you had said you wanted to close with a specific song.
The baffled king composing hallelujah. Nothing can stop these lonely tears from falling. For Richmond, Lord knows they all just want to have total control. Want to know what you think.
Yeah, that's Trump. He took 4 questions, and he completely blew them. There were friendly questions from people in the audience, read by Kristin Kobes, set up. And then there was a couple of medical emergencies in the crowd, which really irritated him. Like, he literally said one of the guys should lose weight because this building was so hot. And then he decided just to play music for 40 minutes. The Republican nominee for president simply stood on stage and swayed or made little hand dances to music for 40 minutes. That's the guy that could possibly be the next president of the United States. And I posit possibly be the next president of the United States for a very short time. He's the oldest man to run for president in American history. His health is clearly degenerated. And right next to him is J.D. Vance, the most unqualified man to run for vice president in modern history. So I thought this is a great time to talk about that piece of this. Luckily, this whole movement, this Christian Nationalist movement, has been well documented. This book right here, Jesus and John Wayne, was a huge bestseller, and I got lucky. I got the author to be on the show. She also has a new movie coming out called For Our Daughters. So, as always, I get the right guest at the right time. We're back in the studio again, so let's get right to it. I am Fred Wellman. You're at On Democracy with FP Wellman, right on the MeidasTouch Network, wherever you get your podcasts. Let's get on with the show. Welcome back in the studio. Back in the studio again. Welcome to On Democracy. As I am Fred Wellman, host of On Democracy, just like I was 30 seconds ago. I am so excited about this show. I'm a little hyped up, as you can see, because I love our guest. Dr. Kristin Kobes Du Mez is a New York Times bestselling author, professor of history and gender studies at Calvin University. I could read this whole thing, Kristin, but the most important thing is your spectacular book, Jesus and John Wayne, which was a huge bestseller and kind of blew up last. I was telling Kristin when we got started, guys. I was saying, my fiance Heather was like reading me, I think I read the whole book through her. And of course, your newest thing we're going to talk about is your new film, For Our Daughters, which is an examination of the systemic sex abuse and cover-up in evangelical churches. I mean, a lot to talk about. Kristin, welcome to the MeidasTouch Network. Welcome to On Democracy.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's so great. So I open the clips of J.D. Vance and his odd way of discussing his faith and his wife. And his kind of slimy, sort of almost bullying approach to talking to interviewers, it feels like we don't know a lot about him. And in many ways, I think that's purposeful. But as I like to say a lot, he's one Big Mac away from being the president. If Trump wins this thing, right? Or one 25th Amendment, if you will. What is his connection to this Christian nationalist movement that you've been studying for years now? There's a connection there, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. There is. The thing to understand Vance and to understand these clips that you see daily on social media, the, jarring, horrifying clips, none of which seem, to make a dent in his popularity, quite the opposite, really, with his base. But the thing to understand about him is that he has been inside these right-wing spaces, media or chatting with podcasters for years now. Yeah. And the kind of rhetoric that shocks us is just, par for the course inside these Christian nationalist podcast spaces. And so if you've been inside these spaces, you know what you're seeing and you know what you're dealing with. And so he has all sorts of connections. One of his tightest connections that we can see is to Kevin Roberts of the president of Heritage Foundation, right?
Yep.
Project 2025 here.
Right.
Vance actually wrote the foreword to Kevin Roberts' book, which unfortunately we can't read right now, or maybe fortunately, I'm not sure, because the publisher has held it back because it is so incendiary. And by incendiary, I mean that quite literally. Like, they had to change the subtitle from "Burning Down Washington to Save America" to "Taking Back Washington to Save America." Okay. Vance is writing, promoting, endorsing that. The ties between Vance, Project 2025 are tight. And Vance is connected to a broader network of what we affectionately call theobros in those spaces. These right-wing Christian nationalist pastors, right?
Yeah.
It is a thick network. And Vance is more tightly connected to these guys than Trump is.
Yeah.
And as we all know, Vance is also far more disciplined than Trump is. When Trump announced Vance as his VP candidate, there was widespread celebration throughout Christian nationalist networks.
And that was purposeful, right? I mean, there was so much. I mean, I think look, I work in normal politics, right? I work in the world of, there's, polls and all that kind of stuff. And I think a lot of people were baffled by how Vance came out of nowhere. He's got, has a year and a half of government service at all. He's clearly the least qualified person to run for vice president in America, but he was widely celebrated. How did that come about? I mean, where do you think that came from?
Yeah, there's a real gap here between kind of the external perception of who is a viable candidate, what's going to play well, and then internally, who's really connected to the centers of power. And with Vance, what we see is, he's Catholic now, conservative Catholic. He actually has evangelical roots. Before then, he's taken quite the spiritual journey.
Yeah.
But I don't know that any particular theology or theological tradition is key to understanding him. It really is this broader umbrella of Christian nationalism, however you come to it. And that's the basis of his networks. But he's an interesting figure because he also has the Peter Thiel connection. And so you have massive funding. And what we see here is like the coming together of the tech bro culture and its funding sources and the theo bro culture and this right-wing Christian nationalist agenda coming together in one person who is potentially steps away from the most powerful position in the country, even the world.
And they've made it very clear they want a Christian nation. They've said very clearly and really shocking things they say. I was actually looking at the trailer for Our Daughters, which we'll discuss later. They say, okay, we have a Christian nationalist country. What happens next day? Women can't vote. I mean, there's some really shocking stuff in that muscular evangelical approach to nationalism. I mean, they do come together in some shocking ways, don't they?
Yeah, and it's really important to understand when they're talking about a Christian America, they have a very precise notion of what that nation will look like. They are not shy about telling us what it's going to look like. Project 2025, we have 900 some pages. There are scores of books and sermons, and they'll tell you exactly what they have in store. It is a hierarchical society. It is one where we have male power and women are to submit to that power. That is the God-ordained order. It is hierarchy and submission all the way down. But really key sentence in Project 2025 that I think illuminates how this world works is the assertion that the Constitution guarantees Americans the right to do what they ought to do, not what they want to do. And what they ought to do, the only way we can understand that is within this right-wing Christian framework. So we know women ought to submit to male authority, right? They have this whole agenda that overlies very tightly with the MAGA agenda right now. And that is how they interpret the Constitution. And they believe that God framed this Constitution. God even inspired this Constitution. Therefore, it cannot possibly guarantee any rights to any Americans that do not align with their understanding of what Americans ought to be doing.
Okay, that's terrifying. And the thing is, what shocks me, but you live in this world, you've studied it, you've studied it in depth. What shocks me is how little are you surprised how little Americans understand it? Do you know what I'm saying? It's like you said very clearly, they're saying what they want to do.
Yes.
Look, we got Harrison Butker, right? The kicker was just out with Josh Hawley. I live in Missouri. They're out here. I guess we just found out this week he's founding a PAC. Okay, he's going to use his football money to found a PAC. I mean, this isn't just, we can't scoff at this, right? They're putting money behind it now, aren't they?
Oh, huge amounts of money. And this is the problem. No, people have not been taking this seriously because there's been this tendency to write off these guys as fringe.
Right.
as extremists. And that's tricky because, yes, they are extremists. But if you look inside these organizations, you have to understand the power dynamics. And these guys wield an incredible amount of power inside organizations through these networks. And it's not just kind of secular Americans who have been kind of blind to what's happening in front of them, but evangelicals themselves, right? When we talk about evangelicals or conservative Christians generally, there are divisions there. There's a spectrum of ideas when it comes to Christian nationalism, for example. But there's a tendency to discount concerns as you're trying to smear all Christians when you talk about this radical extremism. No, this isn't what we believe. This isn't, what we're about. And yet they are voting in ways time and again that actually enable and empower this radical group. And what we've also seen happening over the last few years, even especially this last year, is this right wing of the Christian space is exerting enormous pressure on moderates, these in-group moderates, trying to push them out, disempower them so that they can have control of the evangelical movement, and the control of the country is the ultimate goal.
And they're voting, and that's the thing, right? I mean, I think
they vote.
They vote, right? Yep. I mean, 82%, they're expecting 82% of white evangelicals are expected to vote for Trump this time. I mean,
yes.
So they are voting, and they're organizing to vote, and they're spending money to make sure they do vote, don't they?
There is so much mobilization in these spaces, and this has been going on for more than half a century, right? We can go back to the moral majority. We can go back to these networks, Christian radio. Preachers of churches across the country are giving voter guides. They're telling people what they should do. And you'll hear a lot of, a true Christian cannot possibly vote for Kamala Harris. Real Christians cannot even be Democrats, right? This framework, it is so powerful inside these spaces. So that is absolutely what you'll run up against. And it's certainly something I run up against every day.
And it does explain a lot when we see the baffling resistance to any kind of reason. It seems like, a lot of us who work in politicals, and I'm on a couple campaigns now. Of course, I do my work in other places, Vote Vets and others, and we talk about a lot how immobile they just dig in. It's like, no, you guys are baby killers. You guys are pedos. I mean, it's shocking the beliefs that are being reinforced in those communities. Is it a growing movement in the sense? So let's put that in the larger perspective of America, though. I mean, is it a growing movement within evangelical spaces, or is it a growing movement within the United States as well? Because we do know there has been a shrinking of the Christian, those who call themselves Christians. So is it? I guess I suck at words today. So again, is it a growing movement? Is a shrinking movement becoming more extreme? Does that make sense? Is that what you're saying?
So what we have is, you're right. If you're looking at survey data, if we just look at white evangelicals, for example, their percent of the broader population is shrinking. Right. And has come down from 15 years ago or so. It was at 24%. Now we're at 12.9%. Wow. But they're still voting at 19% of voters. Wow. So they're voting. They're highly motivated, and they vote largely as a block. This 82% it hovers right around that. That's what we tend to see. And then yes, we also see growing radicalization in that space as they push out moderates, as they attack moderates, and also even though we have people leaving the evangelical fold, we have new people coming into that fold, self-identifying as evangelicals, and they are identifying because they share the political agenda, right? And so we have this kind of MAGA drift or even hard turn where it becomes harder and harder to be vocally anti-Trump inside the evangelical space. I heard a really great description from a leader in an evangelical organization who will remain anonymous. And they told me that essentially the memo is you don't have to agree with this political agenda, the MAGA agenda. You just can't speak out against it. So keep your mouth shut and you will be fine inside these spaces. Speak out against it. You're going to be out of a job.
I grew up in the Catholic Church, and this isn't the Christianity I was raised on, right? It's become this muscular American version. We joke with Jesus with an AR-15. Is sort of this movement is how out. I guess in the larger movement in the world, in the global Christian movement, are we outside? Is the U.S. version of this different? I mean, it seems like it is. Am I right or wrong?
Depends which kind of global Christianity you're looking at.
Okay.
Certainly, you can find a lot of Christians around the globe who are looking at what's happening in the U.S. with respect to this political alliance and say, what on earth is happening there?
Right.
You will also have the spread of this right-wing ideology globally. And you're seeing that especially through popular media, through radio, televangelism, and social media. And you're especially seeing this in the charismatic spaces. So, we haven't even talked about kind of the, again, this fringe movement that is fringe, but, tens of millions of people with the New Apostolic Reformation and
Right.
that strand of Christian nationalism. And that has a very powerful international presence, reaching into countries around the globe. But even the more standard right-wing evangelicalism also reaches, Brazil, Uganda, China. I get letters from people around the world saying this is being imported into our churches too, and they're trying to fight back against it.
Oh, it's just scary. And again, it has become a major portion of our political movement. And like I said, I live in Missouri, and you see it in the places that now policies, we have an abortion amendment on the ballot this year. There's an initiative petition to, have restore the rights, women's healthcare rights. I mean, and the churches, I was walking through my old neighborhood I used to live in here, and the Catholic Church had 10 signs around it, no on 3, I mean, they're very, very pushy, and they're very pushed deep into our political movements. So let's talk about, I guess, the last section. How the hell is Donald Trump in this, right? I mean, it's like, I know we constantly get asked that here on the show, how do people who believe these things and call themselves Christians, how do they embrace such a monstrous human being who has such clear hatred for everyone, migrants, immigrants, any people of color? I mean, just this week he said in an interview, one of those bro podcasts, they said, "Oh yeah, I played football. I didn't like getting hit by kids, kids from bad neighborhoods." Well, we know what he meant, And so, I'm sure you're asked that all the time. Where do these movements come together? Is it political expediency?
Yeah, the way the question's often framed is, how could Christians, evangelicals betray their values to vote for a man like Donald Trump? And my answer to that is you just don't understand what their values actually are.
Okay.
Right. And if we put the pursuit of power, and historically you can see the pursuit of white patriarchal power at the center of this cultural and political evangelicalism, as we must, and historically that's the case I make in Jesus and John Wayne, then suddenly we're not looking at a betrayal of values. And Trump knew exactly how to play to this crowd. He promises that he will protect Christianity. I mean, he did that in 2016 on the campaign trail. And by protect Christianity, he means privilege Christianity. Right. I mean, just recently he was talking to a group of evangelicals and telling them, you're going to, when I'm back in office, you're going to have more power than you've ever had before. That is what attracts them. They want that power, and they have justified that power because they have embraced this idea that they represent God. They do what is good and righteous. Therefore, everybody who is against them is necessarily against God. And so this is very much an ends justifies the means mentality. And that's what you see in terms of they don't care about truth as we would define truth, because they are fighting for a bigger truth. Violence, even political violence, this kind of just character assassination, lying about people, misrepresenting reality. They can do that because it is for a greater cause. And that is really this motivating force beneath Christian nationalism. And that's where we can see Trump promises them power. It's no coincidence that the chapter in Project 2025 that's written about executive power is written by Russ Vought, a self-proclaimed Christian nationalist.
Right.
They want that power because they know exactly what they want to do with it.
I mean, I can't help but think this sounds like the Crusades, right? Right? It's like we're willing to slaughter millions, against our Christian faith, because as long as we win and the Christianity wins in the end. I mean, it's sort of terrifying in a lot of ways, isn't it?
I mean, it is terrifying, and it can be kind of difficult to discern exactly what we're looking at because they love militant language.
Right.
They love metaphors of war, of burning things down, of firing up the muskets, loading the muskets, circling the wagons. That's from the Roberts Vance forward.
Yeah.
And so they love that kind of language. And Christianity, particularly these strands of it, love the spiritual warfare language. But at what point does that metaphorical language or spiritual language slip into action? And particularly, I would say, when it is linked in a movement with dehumanization, the tendency to dehumanize your opponents, to dehumanize fellow Americans, dehumanize, immigrants, and so on. And I will say, as a scholar, my outside field was of authoritarianism, 20th century Germany, and those two things, the lies, misrepresentation, and the dehumanization, red flags, certainly.
Woo, it's a good place for a break. I was like, whoo, okay, let's hear from Lumen. I really want to talk about the film For Our Daughters, because this goes right into that, because that dehumanization isn't just for their opponents, it's even within their church, isn't it? So let's take a break and hear from our friends at Lumen, and then we'll come back, and I want to run the trailer after that. So we'll be right back. Lumen is the world's first handheld metabolic coach. It's a device that measures your metabolism through your breath. And on the app, it lets you know if you're burning fat or carbs and gives you tailored guides to improve your nutrition, workout, sleep, and even your stress management. Not that I have stress in my life. Now, all you have to do is breathe in your Lumen first thing in the morning. You'll know what's going on with your metabolism, whether you're burning mostly fats or carbs. Then Lumen gives you a personalized nutrition plan for that day based on your measurements. You can also breathe in before you go on your workouts, before you go for a meal. You know exactly what's going on in your body in real time, and Lumen will give you tips to keep you on top of your health game. So look, your metabolism is your body's engine. We all know this. You probably learned this in health class, right? It's how your body turns the food you eat into the fuel that keeps you going. I've been tracking macros and nutrients and nutrition for years as I try to maintain my health as I age. Because your metabolism is the center of everything your body does, optimal metabolic health translates to a bunch of benefits, including easier weight management, improved energy levels, better fitness results, better sleep, better moods even, if you will. Lumen gives you recommendations to improve your metabolic health right in your hand. So if you want to take the next step in improving your health, go to lumen.me/Fred. You'll get 15% off your Lumen. That is lumen.me/Fred for 15% off your purchase. Thank you, Lumen, for sponsoring our show this week. We really appreciate you. And man, it's a great device. So for this, we talked about earlier, and before the break, we were talking about how that dehumanization of their opponents. But we're also we've seen it within the ranks of the church. And you've got a new film that's now, just last night, we posted it right here on the MeidasTouch Network on Thursday night For Our Daughters. I'd love to I have the trailer. Matt, let's run the trailer real quick.
I regretfully had a sexual incident with a female high school senior in the church.
He tells the world that it had occurred. And everybody stands, and they give him a standing ovation.
A jury in New York has found that Trump sexually abused and defamed E. Jean Carroll and awarded her $5 million in damages.
It may seem surprising that a self-professed moral majority would end up supporting a candidate who has bragged about assaulting women. But if you look inside their own communities, you can see how for decades they have propped up men who have abused power and have excused all kinds of harm, all kinds of abuses for the sake of that power. The ends justifies the means.
I will fight even harder for Christians with 4 more years in the White House. I get in there, you're going to be using that power at a level that you've never used it before.
We wake up tomorrow in a Christian nation. Will women have the right to vote tomorrow if you wave that magic Christian wand?
No.
Macho power is not what Jesus calls for. Jesus himself did not operate in that way. Jesus was gentle. He was humble, particularly in his relationship with women. In that way, he told us men what we are to be like.
And I think what we have to grapple with again is that the reality that those of us who are raising our voices are not calling for a departure from Christ, but rather a return to who Christ really is.
I was shocked the first time I saw that, Kristin. I mean, like you said, we talked about a little bit in the previous conversation about how, women don't get a right to vote, but and these women, these victims, that opening piece is gutting, where he gets a standing ovation after admitting that he actually had a sexual relationship with a teenager. Obviously a rape by every measure, right? So tell us, what led you to this point? I mean, we from Jesus John Wayne, now you're at this point talking about $4. Tell our viewers a little bit about the movie and what's behind all this.
Yeah, well, Jesus and John Wayne is a history of evangelical masculinity and militarism. And when I was researching that, I kept coming across cases of sexual abuse and abuse of power inside their own churches, inside their own spaces. So I was just tracking this. And then fast forward to October 2016, the Access Hollywood tape released. And, everybody thought, oh, surely this is a bridge too far for his evangelical supporters, right? Moral majority and all that. And of course it was not. No. And that's when everything clicked for me. We have seen this before. We have seen that so many times, protecting a perpetrator for the sake of maintaining power and throwing victims under the bus. And so the last chapter of Jesus and John Wayne is just this litany of case after case of abusers. And then what happens when that abuse surfaces is the church circles the wagons and defends the perpetrator, blames the victim, and pushes her out of the church. And so that's a chapter of Jesus and John Wayne. We've now, that chapter inspired this film, where we have several incredibly powerful survivors speak on film about not just their abuse, but particularly how their faith communities and how religious leaders responded to that abuse. And it follows this horrifying pattern of applauding, standing ovations for perpetrators, and absolutely brutally demonizing, sometimes quite literally demonizing survivors and their advocates. Over and over again, we see that pattern. And so we produced this film to draw attention to abuse inside those spaces, to see what happens when this ends justifying the means mentality takes hold, and when you prioritize male power over everything, including justice and including protecting women. And we thought it was important that Americans see. We wanted people inside the church to see this, but we also wanted all Americans, because this is part of that Christian nationalist agenda. Yeah. This is the framework that they are trying to impose on the country as a whole.
It's funny, we think of The Handmaid's Tale, right? And we already talk about Handmaid's Tale all the time, right? It's the big, it's like idiocracy, right? It's become sort of a meme, if you will, of what we face. But I also remember people, they forget that the way The Handmaid's Tale began, the way they took over the government, where Gilead was born, was they slaughtered the Congress. A small group of men literally, assaulted Congress and killed everybody. This is a larger issue than just within the church, isn't it? It is a political movement, and I think you show that in the trailer and the film. Is this isn't just going to be? I think people write it off because they think, well, I'm not in that church. Right. It doesn't affect me. I'm not, but it will affect us, won't it? It is a larger movement than just their size.
Yes. And many of the survivors in the film welcomed the opportunity to take their stories, not just to folks in the church, but to people on the outside as well, because they have seen, as survivor Krista Brown says, these are not the men that I want taking over this country. Right? I've seen it from the inside, and it was bloody awful. And so they are sounding the alarm, and we think that it's critical that people pay attention to this culture, to these patterns, and to this broader agenda. We can't not. I mean, I think that's my frustration too. I was with the Lincoln Project, and in the Lincoln Project had four main pillars. People don't realize we had four main pillars that we were targeting during 2020. I was veterans. I had the veteran pillar. We also had a Latino pillar. We also had a women's pillar. But we had a pillar that was devoted to evangelicals, right? There was a focus on rallying evangelicals. Right? Hey, look, this isn't who you are. This isn't your movement. Is that important to do that? Could it be effective? Is it effective to do that? I think it is important because there are so many voices from the other side coming, at evangelicals saying this is the only way to be Christian, to align with this right-wing agenda. Right. So I do think you need to get into that space. And I think even more so, there are Christians themselves. There are many evangelicals in that space trying to speak out against these forces, and it is brutal for these folks.
Yeah.
They are losing their jobs, right? They are becoming estranged from their families, getting shunned by their churches. And it is really ugly. And so I think that would be helpful if people from the outside realized a little bit more some of these dynamics on the inside. And, there are a lot of people who are feeling alienated and really beaten down, and a lot of people paying some real prices inside those spaces. Does it make a difference? Man, I wish I could give an inspirational talk right now. But as we mentioned, we're at still 82% holding solid of white evangelicals who plan to vote for Trump. So how much of a difference does it make? A good question, which is why that's not I think the only kind of takeaway from this set of concerns. It's also mobilizing people on the other side, so strengthening those inside. But here again, as a student of authoritarian practices, I can say that what we see is textbook in terms of the brutal attacks against in-group moderates, right? Against those moderating forces inside religious movements. That's exactly what's going on. So we need to work to kind of lift up some of those folks and strengthen the voices, including of some of these survivors, right, who are speaking truth to power. But then also, we need to be mobilizing on the outside as well.
Yeah, because we talk about that. I mean, they've written the plan down. Like we said, it's in Project 2025, written by the new NAR. These are really, really militant forces, and they want to impose these. I mean, again, I think that's powerful about the film is, while this has happened in the church, it is the agenda for all of us. That's their agenda is going to be the agenda for all of us. As we saw in the clip there, women won't vote anymore, if they have their way. And I think too many of my fellow Americans kind of dismiss this as not a problem. But again, I live in Missouri, and we see this movement right here at the local level. We see it here at the national level. We see it. Do you think I think this does tie right back to Moms for Liberty, right? It ties back to at the local level. I mean, we have seen some pushback at the local level. Do you take any kind of hope, the fact that at local levels, like I talk about right here, my own school district where my two youngest go, we had two of those Moms for Liberty ladies get on the school board and thank God that the very next year they got beat. I mean, so is there a realization at least at the local level, perhaps?
Yeah. And, first, a little caveat in terms of, that women aren't going to be able to vote, repeal the 19th Amendment, that sort of thing. That is a fringe. That is not the typical view of white evangelicals. It really is not. But again, who are they placing in office, and what are those folks going to end up doing? Right. And there's education that has to happen on the inside of no, actually, this is who you are voting for. And no, are you have these values, these Christian values. Are you also supporting democracy? And if you are, we need to talk, right? Yeah. Or you need to own that. No, you're willing to throw away our democratic government in order to achieve your short-term aims. And then you just need to be upfront about that, right? So again, that's not the majority view inside these spaces. However, most people are going to be voting to empower men who bring that or similar views into that space. So a little clarification, but also Moms for Liberty. Yes, you've got these networks, these organizations, and they can have incredible power on the local level. And if you go to these events and listen to the speeches at places like NatCon and so on, they are training people in the audience to go into their churches, to go into their local communities, and to take it over for the right. And the opposition, whether that's from the left or just ordinary
Normal
folks in the middle,
just normie people who want to go to church, right?
Right. It's not as well orchestrated at all. And so I think there's this delay, there's this lag in terms of a lot of people locally just like, what just happened? Yeah. So you have that in Missouri. We have that here, county over in Michigan. Yeah. Ottawa County has had that too, a right-wing takeover of the county board. And it took a couple of years, but local citizens, including many Republicans who were not MAGA Republicans, came together and are now winning back control and trying to return things to a more normal kind of, it still is conservative, but a more legitimate conservative local government. Yeah. But we don't have a lot of time to do this. Yeah. And the right has really been focusing on state and local level politics. Yep. And the rest of us are kind of scrambling to make sense of what's actually happening.
Yep, and that's I talk about a lot. You see them on social media. I talk about that. This movement is at the local and the state level, and they've been doing this for years, and they're very well organized. And we don't tend to organize. It's hard. How do you organize normies, right?
Exactly.
And I've seen hope in the fact that there's frustration that when you get these folks, these far right, these Christian nationalists, their focus is so much on the cultural issues, they can't even actually run the school board, right? They don't run, and we are seeing a movement where like, actually, I just want my school to run. I want. Because I guess it's like Trump. We're lucky with Trump because he's actually monumentally incompetent. But we can't count on that because, as you see, J.D. Vance, while evil and weird, wearing eyeliner, also is probably pretty competent. Unfortunately, evilly, malignantly, probably competent though, isn't he?
Absolutely. And I mean, to get back to Project 2025, which is a very handy guidebook that we all have that we can read and see this is actually what their plans are.
Yeah.
And it's not just Project 2025. You can look at the Republican, the RNC agenda and the platform, right? Which Trump clearly had a hand in that. And you see, very, very close overlap there. And a widely recognized within Trump circles is that he squandered the first years of his presidency.
Right.
And he didn't have the power, the control that he needed. He wasn't surrounded by loyalists. There were too many people who didn't carry forward his, there were guardrails. So they have very explicit plans to remove those guardrails.
Not this time.
All right. To fire tens of thousands of federal employees, to install Trump loyalists, to weaponize the DOJ. It is all there in black and white.
Right.
And then he says, as we see this week, to even use the National Guard and the military to go after his political enemies. And then he'll name some. And to go after the left and these, internal enemies within, right? We know he's talking about you and me and a whole lot of other people.
Yep.
So, it really is right in front of us right now. And we have to take this seriously. And, one of my goals is to actually talk to conservatives and to talk to conservative Christians and say, okay, you have values and we actually share. I'm a Christian myself. We share a lot of the values. We'll differ on some. Can we just look at the structure right now? Can we agree that your ability to practice your faith and mine to practice mine and other Americans who may have no faith in particular, that all of our best interests are preserved within a democratic system and with the protection of the rule of law and the Constitution?
Yeah.
And if you are ready to abandon that, please just say that vocally.
Right.
And if you are not, right, you really have to step up here and pay some attention.
Yeah. Well, that's a great place to wind things up. I mean, that's the thing. We have to come together as a nation. Remember what we found this nation on, and those were deeply Christian men, but they consciously wrote our Constitution to make clear that wouldn't be the way. There's reasons. There's a joke I make often is like we had a whole ass revolution about this. That applies to a lot of things, right? And it applies to this, and there's a reason we had those conversations. There's a reason those things are written, and I think we just have to remind folks. Well, most importantly, how reception for the book was incredible. Obviously, I mentioned the film. The film's actually been out in some spaces. Where can folks find? I think it's going to either post. I'm looking at my notes. It either post this week or possibly on Monday for MeidasTouch. Like either way, you'll find it. Where can people find out more? Find you, learn more. Other than obviously the best-selling book. Where can they find you, Kristin?
Yeah, you can find out more about the film at forourdaughtersfilm.com. And we have resources there for survivors and a toolkit to host your own viewing parties. And the film is on YouTube so that there are no obstacles. So anybody can access it, including women inside these spaces. That was very important to us.
Yeah.
I'm also on social media, KK Du Mez. And I am on Substack and write regularly about all of these things in that space.
Well, thank you so much. And this has been, I'd love to say really uplifting, but that's it. It's a tough topics. And I wanted to have this conversation as we approach, the last 3 shows I've done have been about how Trump's, the things he did that we forgot. And I want to look forward at the fact that we've got a guy on the ticket who has got some really dark connections that I don't think are being uncovered enough because it is complex, right? And you explain it very well. This is the internal portions of this within the Christian Nationalist movement. It's hard for a lot of people to understand, but it is incredibly, incredibly dangerous to our country as a whole. So thanks for sounding the alarm on everything you do, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
Good luck. Man, just so much to cover. I hope I did an okay job. Brilliant conversation, brilliant book, brilliant film, hard to watch, hard to read both, but so important. And I think the key takeaway for me is you have to understand, while it is a shrinking portion of our population. It's a very powerful and dangerous portion of our population. And now they've got J.D. Vance, one Big Mac, one 25th Amendment away. I mean, I showed you that clip at the beginning of Trump wandering aimlessly for 40 minutes. He stood and swayed for 40 minutes just listening to music. And no matter how much the media wants to sane wash that away, something's not right about Donald Trump right now, okay? And we have to recognize that. And I have to recognize that when we vote for Trump, when people vote for Donald Trump, they're really voting for President J.D. Vance. And that should terrify you as much or more than Donald Trump. And so I won't drag us out much longer. Thanks for joining us. It's a great conversation. As always, you can look for the film where I think it's going up this week. Always find us, as always, at FP Wellman I'm still on X, causing trouble, FP Wellman Official everywhere else. Of course, On Democracy Pod and On Democracy Podcast on YouTube. Really, really appreciate everything you've been doing. Again, we are less than 3 weeks out. We'll be 2 weeks on Tuesday, folks. 2 weeks out from the election. We have the momentum. Don't let them fool you. Don't let them fool you. They do not have momentum. Rash of polls. We're filming this on Wednesday, so you know. Just a gluttony of polls came out today showing Kamala Harris is ahead, okay? That stuff last week of Trump momentum, it's all fake, okay? It's fake. The truth is we're on the right side of this momentum. The only key to it, get out and vote. Nothing else matters. If you can early vote. Get it over with. We will win this thing, but only if you get everyone you know to vote. So get on out there. I'm Fred Wellman. This has been On Democracy, FP Wellman. We'll see you again next week.